everyone. Welcome to today's virtual field trip to Palm Beach County's Mounts Botanical Garden. Our topic of exploration is space plants. Today's live stream event is brought to you by the Scientists in Every Florida School program and Mounts Botanical Garden in Palm Beach County, Florida. The Scientists in Every Florida School program is a free program housed within the Thompson Earth Systems Institute at the University of Florida. The CEFS program aims to connect and build long-term partnerships between teachers and scientists in order to build lasting relationships and bring big research and scientific data into classrooms in Florida and beyond. Mounts Botanical Garden is a nationally acclaimed attraction for Florida residents and visitors alike, with a mission to inspire and educate through nature. Today, you'll be joined by Drs. Annalisa Paul and Rob Ferl of the University of Florida. The two study plant gene expression in response to environmental changes and specifically to the environment during spaceflight and extraterrestrial habitats. Using fail crusts as a model for plants, they have run experiments on both parabolic flights and research aircraft, as well as conducted science at research stations in Antarctica and in the Canadian Arctic to simulate space conditions. They have also been awarded the NASA Medal of Honor for Exceptional Scientific Achievement, which is an honor rarely bestowed to scientists outside of NASA. Today, we'll be taking a virtual tour of the garden in order to explore and understand the possibilities of growing plants in space. If you have questions for either Drs. Paul or Ferl, please put them in the chat box and we'll get to them shortly. Before we turn things over to our scientists, I would like to introduce Diane Rabina, the Youth Programs Manager of Mounts Botanical Garden, in order to set the stage for today's virtual field trip. Diane?
Thanks, Stephanie. Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you for joining us on our virtual tour of Mounts Botanical Garden. For those of you who have not yet been able to visit the garden in person, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what you'll see during a visit here. Mounts Botanical Garden is Palm Beach County's oldest and largest public garden, covering over 14 acres. We have more than 2,000 species of tropical and subtropical plants from 6 continents. Within Mounts Botanical, we have 25 unique display gardens. Here in Florida, it can be very difficult to figure out what will thrive in our challenging subtropical climate, and these display gardens are wonderful examples of what's possible in your own garden spaces. There are thousands of plant species to choose from that will do well in the South Florida heat. We can go to the next slide. So since we're talking about space plants today, we're going to be taking a look at 2 specific display gardens that we have. What you'll see them when you come to Mounts. There are Herb Garden of Well-Being and the Edible Garden. When we talk about growing plants in space, we're mostly focusing on those that will be used as food and those that will be necessary for health and well-being. If you find yourself under the weather in space, you definitely won't be able to take a quick trip through the drive-thru of your local drugstore to pick something up that'll help you make you feel better. So we'll need to consider using plants for medicinal purposes. Our Herb Garden of Well-Being, which you can see here in the picture on the left, was created by renowned herbalist Holly Shimizu. It was designed to showcase herbs and spices that have been used in the tropics and subtropics for a variety of things, such as flavoring for cooking and those used for medicine. Up until recent history, people relied on their gardens for remedies for everything from fevers and headaches to treatments for burns and wounds. Although people living in space will have access to modern medicines, the supplies will not be unlimited, and they may need to look for plants for health and healing. And who doesn't appreciate the ability to add delicious herbs to your meals when you make food taste better that way? When we think of being able to live in space for an extended period of time, we also have to think about the ability to grow crops that are substantial enough to provide food security. And the pictures in the middle are of our edible garden. This is a thriving garden where nutritional fruits and vegetables can be found growing year-round. Here, our horticulturists grow a variety of healthy foods, and they're always trying out new crops to see how well they grow. At any given time, you will find common fruits and vegetables such as cucumbers, corn, and tomatoes growing next to unusual varieties such as 5-foot-long snake beans and red eggplants. Next slide. So what's in store for the future of farming here on Earth? Well, in one word, technology. This is going to be a very exciting year for us here at the garden. In just a few months, we're going to be the first botanical garden in the world to have this thing you see here. It's called a FarmBot. This robotic farmer will plant seeds, remove weeds, water the plants, test soil, monitor the weather, and let you know when the best time to harvest your crops. It will be run completely off grid using solar power to run the computer and power the robot, and using collected rain runoff to water the garden. Since the farm bot knows what is growing and exactly where each plant is, it can deliver exactly the right amount of water to each and every plant separately to make sure they're getting the correct amount of water without any waste. It can also test the soil to let you know if it's lacking any particular nutrients so you can add only what is needed. You will no longer have to worry about leaving your garden unattended if you have to travel or be away for an extended period of time, because cameras can be mounted on the robotic arm so you can see how your plantings are doing, and you can make any adjustments to the program through your phone or your laptop. Being able to manage your garden remotely allows even those with serious physical challenges the ability to take part in gardening and growing their own food. Many large growers are using similar technology on a grand scale to better manage their resources. Although the farm bot doesn't solve the problems of trying to grow plants in zero gravity space conditions, it does give us a glimpse into what robotic farming can do. It gives people the ability to monitor and manage limited resources, just like those living in a space environment will face. And so at this time, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Paul and Dr. Ferl.
All right. All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. First is our technology check. Everybody see my screen okay?
Yep.
All right. So what we're going to talk to you today is, so Rob Ferl and I we're space biologists. We're scientists. We're faculty at the University of Florida that work on plant biology that focuses on how do plants respond to unique and novel environments. And we like to think about it as exploration science and plant biology. Okay. There we go. So let's start out here with this concept that humans are explorers. We all are. It's absolutely in our bones and in our blood. And the difference is whether we're talking about exploring across an ocean of water, like the ancient Polynesians did, or nowadays thinking about exploring across an ocean of space as we take our biology, take ourselves off the planet. And so what we're trying to do is try to figure out what it is we need to take with us to foster that kind of exploration. First and foremost, to get there, all explorers need plants. In fact, plants are what enable us to be explorers and not just tourists, because plants allow us to travel past the restrictions of just taking your picnic basket with us. Plants do this because they're the things that capture the energy from the sun. And they turn the stuff that we don't need, like carbon dioxide and wastewater, into the stuff we do need, oxygen, carbohydrates, and clean water. And this basic chemical reactions of photosynthesis works whether you're talking about a potato field in Idaho or in an Antarctic greenhouse container on the surface of the ice, or of course, if we take our greenhouses with us to Mars. And this is what we're trying to prepare for.
So one of the things that is really interesting as a plant biologist, as a scientist interested in exploration, is that the recognition of the need to have plants with us is not only a scientific reality, but is becoming a reality in our cultural thinking. So if you take a look at the movie The Martian, this, we think, is the very first time where the actual hero of the movie was a botanist. The hero of the movie was an astronaut whose job it was to know how to grow plants and to deal with plants, and whose absolute survival depended eventually on the ability that he had, in this particular instance, to grow food. So first off, how cool is it that Matt Damon is our avatar, our ambassador for the notion that plants not only here on Earth do the things they do for us in terms of making food and clean water and oxygen, but also will do that for us on another planetary surface. And I just absolutely want to leave with you one very primary notion at this point, and that is, as Annalisa mentioned, so far our habit of exploring space is to take enough dried food with us, or get a supply rocket up to the space station so that we have enough food. One of our goals is, by understanding the biology of plants as they leave the surface of the earth, we can make it so that you can, as an explorer, grow your own food and your own medicines and be able to live without resupply. So the whole notion of being a botanist in the space era, we like to think, did for plant biology the very fundamental favor that this slide puts up there. Botanists are no longer just people that understand and grow plants. Botanists can be, as Matt Damon was in the movie The Martian, truly atypical and be explorers and enable the ability of space flight exploration in a very large sense. So Annalisa and I have had the privilege of being some of these non-typical botanists that you see in the pictures here that sort of chronicle some of our space-related work over time. We've had the privilege to be in zero gravity right in the middle at the top there, where planes fly parabolic arcs to reduce gravity or eliminate it so that we can experiment like being in space without getting there. We've been literally to both ends of the earth, and the upper right there, this is an impact crater in the high Canadian Arctic, where along with other space biologists and space scientists, we study what happens and the possibility of growing plants in and around an impact crater. This one happens to be on the Earth, but it's very similar in geology to impact craters on other planetary surfaces. And in the bottom part, especially in the lower left of this figure, you see us at the other end of the Earth in Antarctica, where we participated with NASA as well as the German Space Agency in a high-tech garden, if you will, greenhouse, if you will, but one that's highly containerized and is of the kind of high-tech growth environment that the farm bot that was mentioned earlier is definitely a part of. So the notion that we can study plants in these environments that are very related to actually living and working in space is a real thing. And it's something that botanists can do and be a part of. So largely speaking, again, as you sort of roll through these images of our research environments, in this case from both ends of the earth, you see that we have the opportunity to look at plant growth, development, and the production of food and nutraceuticals in environments here on Earth that are similar enough to what we would find in space or Mars or other places to be of value to the exploration initiatives for NASA. Now, some of those sort of novel environments and places actually do exist in spaceflight exploration now. These are images from the International Space Station, where just a few years ago, for the first time officially, American astronauts ate food that they grew in space. As you can see in the upper left-hand corner there, that very bright light is a unit called the veggie growth unit. It's about the size of 6 or 8 toasters, but it produces food in their house in the space station that they can then go ahead and eat and enjoy. And like most explorers, as was mentioned at the very outset of the presentation, having variety in their food, having freshness in their food, and especially having unique tastes is an important part of the exploration health situation. And again, from our work with the German Space Agency in Antarctica, we can also testify that explorers that are in difficult environments do like to be around their plants, and in fact do like to eat fresh food. So I'm going to turn it over to Annalisa now, because One of the things that we as scientists do, besides the notion of growing food, is just simply to ask the question, do plants know when they're in space? On the left-hand side there, you can see some of our experimental plants growing on the International Space Station through one of the cupola windows looking back at the Earth. Would it surprise you to know that plants know that they're in space? Would it surprise you to know that plants know when they're riding in an airplane or in a Delta jetliner? In fact, they do know that they're there. And we know that they know that they're there, not because plants tell us directly, but because plants do things to adapt to those environments that let us know that they know. Annalisa?
Right. So that is the big question is, how do we know they know? In order to do this, we take a look at, so I just got a message that says start my video. Is this a problem?
I can see it.
Okay.
Here you are.
All right. All right. So what we're talking about is being able to take our plants into novel environments to see how that they respond, how they respond to the sort of familiar environments, the types of lighting and habitats that everyday plants have to deal with. But also you got to remember that we're taking our plants to novel environments, places that are absolutely outside the evolutionary experience of any terrestrial organism. And we're asking them, tell us how you feel, right? Tell us how you are responding to these environmental cues, these stimuli that you have no idea how to deal with because you didn't evolve with those. And so we do that predominantly with a plant that is commonly called thale cress, although I have to tell you guys that nobody really calls Arabidopsis thale cress except when they're trying to find a common name for it. All of us call it Arabidopsis thaliana, or just Arabidopsis for short. It's a small plant. It grows seed to seed in a couple of months, and so it's great for experimental purposes. And it also gets happily grown on 10-centimeter Petri plates, which you can see up in sort of the middle of this image. And like Rob said, we've taken them to all manner of different type of habitats, including the International Space Station up on the left, in performance jets and parabolic aircraft that gives us short periods of microgravity, in addition to what we call suborbital aircraft that do these long parabolic arcs of high gravity and then about 5 minutes of zero gravity. And those are kind of experiments that we're doing all the time. So again, how do we know? How do we know how they respond? We know this by looking at the tools that they use. And this is true of any kind of job that you undertake. You can see what the job was about by looking at what tools got pulled out of the toolbox. And in this case, we're looking at their genes. And so you can think of your repertoire of genes that you have that you can mobilize at in response to any kind of situation as your genetic toolbox, and plants are the same. And so when plants respond to their environment, they turn genes on that are either higher than they normally do, or they're repressed compared to what they normally do. And these, what we call differential expression of genes, what gets turned on, what gets turned off in response to any given environment, we can categorize and we can map. And they're often depicted in sort of this little graphic configuration of bars of green and red, where green means a gene is repressed compared to normal, and then red is where they're induced compared to normal. And so if you just take a look at those patterns to the left, that's just a graphic representation of when you take a plant to space, and in this case, it's two different types of plants, some genes are turned on and off compared to what it normally takes just to hang out in your ground environment. And by looking at those patterns, by looking at which genes are important, we can tell, first of all, how stressful it is for a plant to be in that environment. And we can also tell what's important. And so by understanding these tools, by which tools plants are pulling out of their toolbox, we know what's important to them to thrive in those environments. And that's a big part of what we do. Because basically, what do we need to know before we go? So one of the stories that we're going to tell you is how do plants use these tools to adapt to their environment. And it dovetails in really nice with the story of another very atypical botanist who's also curious about how plants respond to stimuli. And in this case, gravity and touch. And so everybody is real comfortable with this concept that roots grow down and shoots grow up. Ever since you grew your first bean in a jar, this is a real familiar phenomenon. You also know that when plants grow against walls or grows against surfaces, they look a little bit different. And this is what intrigued this guy right here, Charles Darwin, as he noticed that when plants were growing on surfaces, they grew a little different than they normally did just growing in the dirt. And so he wanted to test some of those experiments. And so what he did is he grew plants, he and his son grew plants on different slanted surfaces. And they noticed that instead of growing straight, they did this kind of little jog to the left thing. And that really intrigued him, and came to the conclusion that plants sense their environment and they respond to the stimuli of their environment by doing two things. Gravity is required to guide them, and that they also use the surface of the way they touch to see how the patterns that they grow. Well, so now think about growing plants in a microgravity environment. So you're growing plants on the space station. They have no gravity clues as to which way to go. So you might envision that they grow all random. But what happens is this, is that a number of years ago, about 100 years after Darwin, we were growing plants on the space station on these agar plates where they have all their nutrient tied up in a sort of a jello matrix. And they have a little lighting ahead of them in the habitat in which they're growing. And that instead of growing straight away from the light or grow totally randomly, they had the same kind of behaviors as Darwin saw about 100 years ago. The big difference being that Darwin said that this required gravity. And so by our space-flight experiments, we discovered that this particular phenomenon doesn't require gravity at all, but it's an inherent part of how plants navigate with their roots to get away from where they're planted. When we took a little closer look at this, we found that a lot of the genes that are being used in these plants are actually different than what plants use on the ground when they grow. And part of the number of genes that are being induced in these plants are ones that sense light. So instead of being able to use gravity to respond to the gravity stimuli, plants are generating a new tool or pulling a new tool out of their toolbox that allows them to sense light with their roots. And so they can grow away from the light when they don't have gravity to tell them which way to grow. So we thought that was pretty cool. And again, it allows us to take a look into how plants respond. So where do these insights take us? What are we learning from this? So the research we're doing in space and these extreme environments does indeed help us prepare for exploration, absolutely. It also helps us solve some mysteries that you never would have been able to solve if you weren't able to take gravity out of the equation like you can on the space station. But it also does something else. And it helps us build tools and systems that help us grow food on Earth better too. And for this, I'm going to turn it back over to Rob.
So one of the things that Annalisa just sort of went through there very quickly is because we could grow plants in space and because we could grow plants without gravity, which Darwin could not do, we had the rare privilege of proving Darwin wrong. Now, I don't know how many people in their scientific careers ever have that potential to do, but in this particular case, Darwin was wrong. He assumed that gravity was guiding the roots in those behaviors when it turns out that gravity wasn't involved at all. Next slide, Annalisa. So the toolbox that Annalisa mentioned in terms of gene expression behavior is one way that we can query plants and understand what's going on in their environment and in their metabolism to adapt to certain environments. There are other ways that are sort of really interesting to look at that have very real world implications for here on Earth. And one is simply to look at what the wavelengths bounce off from plants as they grow. It turns out that healthy plants reflect near infrared a lot more than stressed plants. And this particular way allows something called NDVI, infrared imaging, to be used to study plant health in terrestrial environments. And next slide. This particular approach of looking at different wavelengths through filters on your camera is one way to look at the health of plants as they are growing in their environment. We do this in the laboratory next, and we also do this as part of a connection with personal farming here on Earth, where either on your farm bot or on your drone or using satellite imagery, you can collect similar images of the plants that are growing in your environment and ask whether or not they are healthy or stressed. This is one way that we are using technologies similar to what you can deploy here on Earth. In other words, putting cameras, either GoPro cameras or web cameras in the growth environments in Antarctica, for example, to ask questions about plant health using imagery that is very similar to the cameras that you can build here on Earth. And if you look at the kind of very local food production units, either if you look on the left, that's the one that's on the ice in Antarctica, or on the right, that's a commercial container that has been modified to grow plants and food very locally. Next slide. Not only are the interiors of these space-related and very commercially available plant production units similar, but you can also use this sort of imagery that sounds very space-based, but is very real-world available now to study the health of the plants that you're growing in your gardens or in your production units, or even in the ones that might be growing in your kitchen. Next slide, please.
So we'll leave you right about here with this concept that we're building the future kinds of landscapes now. We're developing the technologies and the approaches that allow us not only to explore our universe, explore our solar system rather, in new ways and new capabilities for food security in our exploration endeavors, but also be able to take what we've learned in containerizing systems, making things smaller, making them more compact, more energy efficient, more ability to use the local resources from any place where we land to make an efficient and safe mechanism to grow food for colonists and astronauts and visitors to another world. We're also able to use those same kind of technologies for food security on Earth to be able to be better and more efficient in greenhouses, and able to use fewer resources and energy here as well as in new environments. And so we ask you, join us, help us grow these landscapes for the future, and be an atypical botanist and explore your worlds. And with that, we'll say thanks. Thanks for joining us on the journey.
Dr. Paul and Dr. Ferl, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us. If any viewers have any questions for our experts, please write them in the chat box and who you would like me to ask that question to, and I will ask on your behalf. Our first question for today is going to come from Kaylee, who would like to ask Dr. Paul, does your research require you to communicate with astronauts at all?
Actually, yes, it does. So it's interesting though, when you communicate with astronauts, when we launch an experiment, we're not allowed to talk to the astronauts directly. What we have to do is we go through 3 or 4 different nodes of communication where the astronaut will say, all right, I'm unpacking your experiment, I'm seeing this, can you tell us about some question that they have? They'll tell that to one person, and then that person will come to another person who's NASA communicators, and eventually they'll get us on the phone and say, yes, and answer that question, then it'll go backwards. So Sometimes we do. The other thing we do is we train astronauts. And so before the experiment launches, we travel out to Houston, and Rob and I will sit in a room with the astronauts and show them how to harvest plants or any kind of other nuance that is important to running our experiment.
There are a couple other things to mention with regard to astronauts as well. For any of us living in Florida, of course, we're aware that the commercial crew launch happened not too long ago, sending people from the coast of Florida to the International Space Station. When our scientists launch, when our astronauts launch, they become our partners in science in space. And the notion that we talk to them is so multifaceted that it really is worth sort of saying again. They are scientists going there. They're eager to learn about what we're interested in doing in our science. They like listening to the training. They carry training videos that we produce. They have files that they can study. But when they do have questions, they'll call down and those questions will get to us and we can answer them.
Our next question today comes from Chris, and maybe Dr. Ferl could start this one and then Dr. Paul. Chris says, I'm a middle school teacher and I'm curious what advice you would give students to see the real world application of the science they are learning.
I think there are a number of sort of nuanced answers to that question. And for me, the first thing I would say is that real world application is a very important part of science, but it is not the only part of science. For me, curiosity is the main driver for doing science. What makes things work? What in the world lets us believe, think, or even imagine that a plant could live on Mars? There's no real world application for that particular scientific question. But for me, it's extraordinarily interesting. Who would ever think, who thinks that it's even possible for a plant to grow on the moon? Why would we even think that? And yet, when we ask those questions, inevitably, we come up with real world applications that have to do with making our lives better here on Earth. So my middle schooler answer would be first that science is interesting simply because it is interesting and fun to wonder about. And then the second part of that would be when we find out stuff having to do with being on the moon or in a jet airplane with a plant, who would have ever guessed that it teaches us how to have plants that are more healthy here on Earth?
Yeah, so I think Rob said it all really well, and I agree completely in that, yep, it's okay to think about real world applications and things, but applications come with exploration and with curiosity and to paraphrase Miss Frizzle from Magic School Bus, getting messy and making mistakes. Absolutely, we find the answers, and the answers, you don't have to search for them to have application. They'll come with the exploration.
Our next question today comes from Ron, and maybe this time, Dr. Paul, you can start. It says, when it comes to growing plants in space, do you have control over the light source when it comes to wavelengths and things like that? Or can you use incoming space sun rays that are not attenuated by our atmosphere?
Oh, good question. Basically, yes, we do control things. To my knowledge, there have been no experiments that directly use light coming in through the window, for instance. Now, although you saw that one video of one of our plates floating in the cupola window, and they were getting ambient light from that, that wasn't their natural where they were growing. That was just one of the astronauts at the end of the experiment was playing with it and put it out there, because astronauts love plants. They like to have access to them. But we do control the lighting. All of the plant habitats are run with LED lighting, which is carefully controlled for optimizing photosynthesis. And so depending on which habitat you're growing things in and which type of crop or which type of plant you're growing, those wavelengths are tuned or tailored to that particular environment. However, there was one experiment that we ran where we were asking some of these questions about route navigation, that we asked the astronauts just to slap them up against the wall. And so we quite literally took those plates. They were inside a plant habitat. They were just Velcroed to the inner surface of the space station in ambient light, which was very diffuse, and so it didn't have a directional component to it, and asked, do the same genes that get turned on in the plants where they have this directional light to help them grow away from where they're planted, do those same genes engage in these ones where they have no directional light? And the answer is, no, it's a whole different set of genes. But that's another story.
So there are so many scientific questions embodied in that particular question about using light. So many really important engineering and exploration questions having to do with how would we grow plants on the surface of Mars. For example, would we use the light that gets to Mars to grow plants, or would we grow plants in a lava tube with LED lights? These are very, very good questions. The first logical thing is to think that using ambient light from the 24 hours of sunlight in space would be a great way to go. And in fact, there are at Kennedy Space Center places where solar collectors on the roof gather light and then use lucite light pipes to deliver that sunlight into growth chambers that otherwise wouldn't see light. So NASA is very interested in exploring the possibility of using ambient light, sunlight, to grow plants. The other thing I really feel a need to mention is that the very first plant growth experiment to be done in space was done in something called Skylab, and it was done in the 70s. And believe it or not, it was a high school experiment looking at rice germinating and growing in space at a window in Skylab. So, yep, it's been done. The first time it was done was actually with a high school experiment, and that remains, to the best of our knowledge, the very first time that plants were intentionally grown in space.
Right, right. Yeah, it's a good one.
And our final question this morning is going to come from Ankit. And Dr. Ferl, maybe you can start with this one. Ankit asks, how much has astrobotanical research helped in improving modern agriculture on Earth?
I'll answer that question in a couple of ways, and then I want to hand it off to Annalisa. One of the things that FarmBot and the kinds of imaging that's done with FarmBot has done is taken really high-tech lessons from the space environment and turned it into useful agricultural information or horticultural information. The first is those sort of falsely colored, weird colored pictures that I showed from fields. That actually started as a space flight, a satellite observation set of experiments called Landsat. And Landsat images are images taken from space of fields, forests, all sorts of ecosystems from space in order to identify the health of those systems here on Earth. So space-based imagery has been used on the very large scales here on Earth now for decades to understand and better manage farms here on Earth based on that kind of imagery. And that same kind of imagery is now what's used in drones on a very local farm environment to improve an understanding of plant health. And getting back to the original picture of the botanical garden and FarmBot with precision agriculture of that capability, believe it or not, things like GPS positioning, high precision water delivery, those all have some origins back into the space program.
And when you look at it from another perspective too, if we'll tunnel down even deeper, spaceflight, remember, is this novel environment. And when we learn more about how plants respond at the physiological level to novel kinds of situations and novel stressors, we also learn more about how plants respond to novel and stressful environments on Earth as well. A lot of the same kind of metabolisms and metabolic tools to adjust are used in both the spaceflight environments and also in stressful environments on Earth. And so we're learning more about basic plant metabolism in response to stress by doing some of the spaceflight experiments. In addition, some of the strategies that we use to mitigate stress in spaceflight are also being applied to other types of protected agriculture on Earth. And so the strategies of minimizing the kind of energy utilization that are required, being able to use what we call in situ resources. And so if you're growing containerized habitats in the high Canadian Arctic for a local community, for instance, you're able to use some of the local resources to reduce your footprint of your environment, but also grow things that have not been able to ever grow there before to enhance the food security of that community. So there's a lot of different aspects of where exploration science does indeed come back and touch the way we do things here on Earth. And sometimes it seems very obvious, like learning how to grow things smaller with less energy. And sometimes it's more subtle and you don't realize it until you try it, that you're seeing new and innovative ways on how to do things here. So it touches us in a lot of different ways.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate both of you and for spending your time with us. Stephanie, at this point, I'm going to turn things over to you as we begin to wrap up today's session.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. And thanks everyone for joining us on today's call to learn more about the experiments and great, amazing studies that are happening with plants and space exploration. A special thanks to both Drs. Paul and Ferl for joining us once again today for this tour. You can learn more about all of our programs by visiting the websites you see here on your screen. And you can also find a recording of today's session along with other past Mounts virtual trips that we've done, including wild architecture and wicked plants, by visiting us at our UF Earth Systems YouTube channel. Again, thanks from everyone here and have a great day. Goodbye.